Imagine a world where every city was a separate state with its own laws, gods, and proud citizens. A world where the freedom and independence of the city-states were not just an ideal, but the very essence of life. This was ancient Greece, the cradle of philosophy, art, and democracy. But even in this seemingly unshakable world, change was brewing. Changes that came not from the very heart of Hellenic civilization, but from its northern outskirts, from lands that had long remained in the shadow of the great city-states. What could compel the proud Athenians and the stern Spartans to bow their heads before a new power? What force could unite the disparate Greek lands and direct their collective gaze eastward toward distant and rich empires? The answer to these questions lies in the history of a previously little-known kingdom that suddenly transformed from the periphery of history into its epicenter. This is the story of Macedonia, the story of its rise, and the story of a man whose name is forever inscribed in the annals of global conquest. Let's immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of ancient Greece, where city-states lived their own lives, with their joys and sorrows, their wars and competitions. Athens shone with its cultural grandeur. Sparta was renowned for its warriors, and Corinth flourished thanks to trade. It seemed this way of life would last forever. However, in the north, among the mountains and forests, a power was growing that was preparing to change the entire known world. This power was unlike the familiar Greek city-states. It was more centralized, more unified, and its ambitions extended far beyond the boundaries of a single city. To the north, beyond the Thessalian plains, lay Macedonia, a land not always at the forefront of Greek chronicles. Its early rulers, whose names were rarely heard in the Athenian agora or Spartan councils, laid the foundation for future greatness. Macedonia's geography, with its fertile valleys, rich forests, and strategically important passes, played no small role. This land possessed resources and potential waiting for its moment. And that moment arrived with the birth and accession to power of Philip II. Philip II is a figure often overshadowed by his famous son, Alexander the Great. But it was Philip who became the architect who created an army and a state capable of changing the course of history. He was not just a warrior, but also a brilliant reformer. His military innovations, such as the famous Macedonian phalanx with its long spears, the sarissa, and new cavalry tactics, made his army virtually invincible. He understood that strength lay not only in weapons, but also in organization. He created a professional army that was loyal to him personally, not to individual cities. But Philip was more than just a military genius. He was also a skilled diplomat. He knew how to exploit the tensions between Greek city-states, supporting some and weakening others. He knew how to find compromises and, when necessary, act decisively. His goal was not simply conquest, but unification. He began by strengthening his own power, uniting the disparate Macedonian tribes, and securing the northern borders of his kingdom. This was no easy task, requiring not only strength, but also wisdom. After Macedonia became a strong and united state, Philip turned his attention south to Greece. He saw the fragmentation of the Greek city-states, their constant internecine strife, which weakened them in the face of external threats. Philip offered them unity under his leadership. He didn't always resort to force. He often used diplomacy, offering alliances and protection. However, when the city-states refused to submit voluntarily, he was prepared to resort to force. A key moment in his rise was his participation in the Phocian War. This war, sparked by the sacrilege of the Phocians, who plundered the temple treasures at Delphi, became an excellent opportunity for Philip to intervene in Greek affairs. He acted as the defender of Delphi and punished the Phocians, thereby significantly strengthening his influence on the peninsula. He received a seat on the Amphictyonic Council, which gave him legitimacy and the opportunity to influence pan-Greek affairs. And so, the year 1338 BC arrived, the Battle of Chaeronea. This battle was a turning point. Here, two forces clashed. The united army of the Greek city-states, led by Athens and Thebes, and the invincible Macedonian army of Philip. The outcome was predetermined. The Macedonian phalanx, with its discipline and new tactical techniques, won a decisive victory. This battle marked the end of the era of independent Greek city-states. Their centuries-long history of self-government was coming to an end, giving way to Macedonian hegemony. After the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip became the undisputed leader of Greece. He did not abolish the city-states, but brought them under his rule. He created the League of Corinth, a union of all Greek states under the auspices of Macedonia. The purpose of this union was not only to maintain peace within Greece, but also to prepare for a grand campaign to the east against the powerful Persian Empire. Philip saw this as an opportunity to end the centuries-long confrontation between the Greeks and Persians and avenge the Persian invasions of Greece in the past. He dreamed of uniting the entire Hellenic world in a single campaign. But fate decreed otherwise. Just before the campaign began, in 1336 BC, Philip was assassinated. His legacy, his army, and his plans fell to his young son, Alexander. Alexander, barely 20 years old, was destined not only to inherit the empire, but also to realize his father's grandiose plans. Alexander III, known to the world as Alexander the Great, was his father's son, but also a unique individual in his own right. His education under the great philosopher Aristotle shaped him as a ruler and commander. Upon ascending the throne, Alexander faced immediate challenges. The Greek city-states, sensing the weakness of central authority after Philip's death, began to revolt. The resistance of Thebes was particularly stubborn. This ancient city, once one of the greatest in Greece, had become a symbol of defiance. Alexander, demonstrating decisiveness and severity, suppressed the rebellion. Thebes was destroyed, and its inhabitants sold into slavery. This act of intimidation demonstrated to all that Macedonian rule would not tolerate disobedience. Alexander then turned his gaze to the east. In 1334 BC, he crossed the Hellespont, the strait separating Europe from Asia, and began his great campaign. The initial battles with the Persians were fierce but victorious. At the Granicus River, he routed the Persian army, opening the way to Asia Minor. Then, at the Battle of Issus, he clashed with the Persian king Darius III himself, and again won, capturing Darius's family. The conquest of Asia Minor was swift. Alexander proved himself not only a brilliant military leader, but also a wise administrator. He founded new cities, which he named Alexandria in his honor, spreading Greek culture and language throughout the conquered territories. One such Alexandria was the city in Egypt at the mouth of the Nile, which remains one of the largest and most important cities in the world. The conquest of Egypt was strategically important, as it secured control over important trade routes and resources. The culmination of the Eastern Campaign was the Battle of Gaugamela in 1331 BC. Here, Alexander faced the massive army of Darius III. Once remote and little known, Macedonia, located in the northern Greek world, was poised to rise from the periphery to the very center of history. Unlike the famed cities of Athens or Sparta, this region had long remained in the shadows. Macedonia's geographic location contributed to its isolation. Mountains and dense forests created natural barriers, and fertile valleys such as Pelagonia and Eordia were inhabited by tribes who lived according to their own customs, often distinct from those of the southern Greeks. Livestock farming flourished here, and agriculture was closely tied to natural cycles. Life was simple and closely connected to the land and nature. The early rulers of Macedonia, members of the Argead dynasty, laid the foundations for future greatness. Among them, one can mention King Perdiccas I, who, according to tradition, founded the dynasty in the 7th century BC. These rulers gradually consolidated their power, uniting disparate tribes under their rule. They strove to build a more organized state, where royal authority would carry more weight than that of individual clan leaders. This was a slow but steady movement toward centralization. The preconditions for Macedonia's rise were multifaceted. First, its geographic location. Situated at the crossroads of trade routes, Macedonia had the potential for economic development. Second, its relatively young state structure allowed it to implement reforms without the same level of resistance as the older, established Greek city-states might have encountered. Third, the constant need for defense against northern barbarian tribes stimulated the development of military science. The Macedonians were a people accustomed to harsh conditions and ready to defend their land. The Macedonian army played a key role in the formation of the Macedonian state. Although it differed from the famous Spartan phalanx, the Macedonian army gradually acquired its own unique characteristics. Its core was infantry, armed with long spears called sarissas and wearing bronze armor. Cavalry also played a significant role, especially in the later period. Gradually, the Macedonian kings began to recruit mercenaries, which allowed them to increase the size of their forces and employ new tactical techniques. During this period, while the southern Greek city-states were preoccupied with their internal strife and rivalries, Macedonia, remaining aloof from the main events, quietly and consistently strengthened its position. Its kings, such as Amyntas III, father of Philip II, had already begun to pursue policies aimed at strengthening their borders and establishing control over neighboring territories. They understood that a strong and unified state was essential for survival and prosperity. Thus, Macedonia, once modestly located on the northern fringes of the Greek world, gradually gained strength. Geographical features, wise if not always widely known rulers, and the constant need for defense created unique preconditions for its future rise. This was a time when a power was emerging that would soon change the course of history for the entire Hellenic world. It was during this period, while the southern Greek city-states were preoccupied with their internal strife and rivalries, that Macedonia, remaining aloof from the main events, quietly and consistently strengthened its position. Its kings, such as Amyntas III, father of Philip II, had already begun to pursue policies aimed at strengthening their borders and establishing control over neighboring territories. They understood that a strong and united state was essential for survival and prosperity. Thus, Macedonia, once modestly located on the northern fringes of the Greek world, gradually gained strength. Geographical features, wise if not always widely known rulers, and the constant need for defense created unique preconditions for its future rise. This was a time when a power was emerging that would soon change the course of history for the entire Hellenic world. Now we come to the figure whose name became synonymous with Macedonian greatness, Philip II. He ascended the throne in 1359 BC at the age of just 23. His reign, which lasted until 1338 BC, marked an era of radical transformation for Macedonia. Philip was more than just a king. He was a visionary, a strategist, and a tireless reformer. One of his greatest achievements was the creation of a professional army. Before Philip, Macedonian warriors, as in most Greek city-states, were primarily militias, mustered for defense in case of attack. Philip, however, understood that ambitious goals, whether defense against external enemies or expansion of influence, required a permanent, well-trained, and disciplined army. He began recruiting soldiers on a permanent basis, turning them into professionals. These warriors received regular pay, underwent rigorous training, and were loyal to their king. The foundation of this new army was the famous Macedonian phalanx. Philip improved it, making it an even more formidable force. The infantryman's main weapon was the sarissa, a long spear ranging from 4 to 7 meters in length. Maintaining such a weapon in formation was difficult, but in a close phalanx formation, the sarissas created an impenetrable wall of spears aimed at the enemy. The warriors also wore bronze helmets, breastplates, and greaves, providing them with reliable protection. But Philip didn't stop at infantry. He recognized the importance of cavalry, especially in the Macedonian terrain. He reorganized the cavalry, making it more mobile and effective. Particular attention was paid to the royal guard, the heteroi, meaning comrades. These were elite horsemen, the king's personal elite, who played a decisive role in many battles. Beyond organization, Philip also introduced a number of military innovations. He began using siege weapons, such as ballistas and catapults, which gave him an advantage when taking fortified cities. He also paid close attention to tactics, training his soldiers to maneuver on the battlefield, combine infantry and cavalry, and employ flanking attacks. However, Philip was not only a warrior, but also a skilled diplomat. He understood perfectly well that military strength must be backed by political wisdom. He knew how to forge alliances, bribe opponents, and exploit the tensions between Greek city-states to his advantage. His diplomatic talents allowed him to gradually expand his influence without constantly resorting to open war. He often offered peace and cooperation, but was always prepared to use force if necessary. Philip also carried out important administrative and economic reforms. He unified the monetary system, which facilitated the development of trade. He encouraged the development of gold and silver deposits, which provided the treasury with funds for maintaining the army and conducting foreign policy campaigns. He also promoted the development of infrastructure, building roads and fortifying cities. Life in Macedonia under the rule of Philip II differed from life in the southern Greek city-states. Elements of tribalism still remained, but the king steadily moved toward the creation of a centralized state. Simple farmers and herders, who formed the backbone of Macedonian society, gradually began to feel the influence of the new order. Their sons became professional warriors, which for many offered a chance for a better life and glory. Cities such as Pella, the capital of Macedonia, were bustling with activity. New buildings were erected, crafts developed, and merchants arrived. Philip patronized the arts and sciences, inviting renowned philosophers and poets to his capital. Thus, Philip II, relying on Macedonia's geographical advantages and natural resources, created a powerful military machine and skillfully utilized diplomatic tools. He transformed his country from a minor kingdom into a dominant power in the Balkan Peninsula. His reforms laid the foundation for future conquests that would forever change the map of the ancient world. This was the time when the Macedonian eagle began to spread its wings, preparing for a flight that would shake the foundations of the established world order. After Philip II consolidated his power and began reforming Macedonia, his attention turned to the kingdom's northern borders. These lands, bordered by wild tribes, were a constant source of unrest. To ensure the security of his kingdom and create a solid foundation for further expansion, Philip had to conduct a campaign to pacify them. Various tribes, including the Agrionians, Longians, and Paeonians, lived in northern Macedonia. They were known for their warlike nature and semi-nomadic lifestyle. For the Macedonian kingdom, these tribes were more of a hindrance than an ally. Their raids could disrupt trade, and their unpredictability posed a constant threat. Philip understood that for the stability of his kingdom, he needed to either subjugate these tribes or protect himself from their hostility. Around the middle of the 4th century BC, or 1600 BC, Philip began his military campaigns against these northern neighbors. He acted decisively, but also demonstrated diplomatic acumen. Not all tribes were subjugated by force. Some were bound by treaties. Others received land or other benefits for their loyalty. Philip's goal was not simply destruction, but integration, or at least neutralization of these groups. One of the key tasks was strengthening the borders. Philip understood that well-fortified positions were essential for protection from external threats. He ordered the construction of fortresses and watchtowers along the northern borders. These structures served not only as defensive points, but also as centers of control over the local population and trade routes. Warriors stationed in these fortresses maintained order and gathered information on the movements of potential enemies. Everyday life in these northern territories, now under Macedonian influence, gradually changed. Whereas tribal life had previously been subordinated to the rhythms of nature and traditional customs, it now began to be influenced by Macedonian customs. Local leaders who had previously wielded complete authority over their fellow tribesmen were now forced to acknowledge the supremacy of the Macedonian king. This did not always proceed smoothly, and sometimes military displays of force were required to remind them of the new reality. However, despite the military actions, Philip sought to minimize the suffering of the civilian population. He understood that a devastated land would bring him no benefit. Therefore, when tribes were subjugated, they were often given the opportunity to retain some of their traditions and customs, as long as this did not conflict with the interests of the kingdom. Some young men from these tribes were even given the opportunity to serve in the Macedonian army, which for them represented a chance for a better future and social advancement. Thus, during this period, around 1600 BC, Philip II not only expanded the territory of his kingdom, but also laid the foundations for its internal stability. He undertook the subtle task of integrating the northern lands, combining military might with diplomatic flexibility. Fighting the tribes and strengthening the borders were an important step toward transforming Macedonia into a dominant power. It was a process that required time, patience, and a deep understanding of both military affairs and human nature. Macedonian influence spread, and the northern lands gradually became an integral part of the kingdom's growing power. Life in the Greek city-states on the eve of change was measured and predictable. Each city, from majestic Athens to stern Sparta, had its own established customs, its own gods, and its own heroes. People lived to the rhythm of agricultural cycles, celebrated their festivals, and debated matters of state and everyday life in the agora, the main square. But beyond these prosperous, though often warring cities, in the north a new power was growing. This was Macedonia, a land with a harsh climate and a warlike people, which was gradually gaining strength. The territory of Macedonia, located north of the main Greek centers, was less fertile but rich in forests and metal deposits. Mountains protected it from invasion, and rivers served as communication routes. The early Macedonian kings, descended according to legend from Heracles himself, gradually united the disparate tribes under their rule. They were skilled warriors and able politicians, and their kingdom, although it remained for a long time on the periphery of the Greek world, grew in strength. Geography played a role, making Macedonia a natural barrier to invasions from the north, but simultaneously isolating it from its more developed southern neighbors. However, it was precisely this isolation that allowed the Macedonian rulers to forge their own unique path of development, focusing on strengthening domestic authority and building a strong army. The key figure in this story was Philip II, King of Macedonia, whose reign marked the beginning of a new era. Philip was not only a military leader, but also a brilliant reformer. He understood that achieving Macedonian greatness required not only the bravery of soldiers, but also their discipline, training, and modern weaponry. It was Philip who created the Macedonian phalanx, a battle formation in which infantrymen, armed with long spears, sarissas, acted as a single invincible organism. He introduced regular training and developed a supply and logistics system, allowing his army to operate over long distances and for extended periods. In addition to military innovation, Philip was a master diplomat. He knew how to find allies, negotiate favorable treaties, and exploit the differences between Greek city-states to his advantage. His court became a magnet for talented people, including, it is believed, the great Athenian philosopher Aristotle, who tutored the young Alexander, Philip's heir. The unification of Macedonia and the northern Greek lands was a difficult process. Philip encountered resistance from the warlike tribes inhabiting the borderlands. These tribes, accustomed to independence and free morals, were unwilling to submit to the Macedonian king. Philip, however, acted decisively, but also with understanding. He sought not only to conquer, but also to integrate these lands into his kingdom. He offered favorable terms to those who voluntarily submitted to his authority, and demonstrated force to those who disobeyed. The goal was not devastation, but the establishment of order and security. Young warriors from the conquered tribes were given the opportunity to serve in the Macedonian army, which offered them not only income, but also a chance for social advancement. Thus, gradually, the kingdom's borders were strengthened, and its influence spread. Philip's next major step was his intervention in Greek affairs. He took advantage of a period of disunity and civil strife among the Greek city-states. The so-called Phocian War, or Sacred War, which began in 1437 BC, played a particularly significant role. This war was sparked by a conflict between Delphi, a sacred city, and the Phocians, who, according to other Greeks, had desecrated the sacred grounds. Philip, acting as a defender of the interests of Apollo and Delphi, gained the opportunity to bring his troops into Greek territory. He skillfully navigated the various factions, supporting those who benefited him and punishing those who opposed him. His intervention was perceived in different ways. Some saw him as a savior, others as a threat to the freedom of the city-states. But for Philip, it was an opportunity to strengthen his position and demonstrate that Macedonia was ready to play a leading role in Greek affairs. A turning point in the history of Greece and Macedonia was the Battle of Chaeronea, which took place in 1438 BC. It was a monumental battle in which the Macedonian army under Philip clashed with the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. The battle was fierce and bloody, but the Macedonian phalanx, thanks to its discipline and tactical superiority, achieved a decisive victory. This victory was of enormous significance. It ended the independence of many Greek city-states and established Macedonian hegemony over all of Greece. Athenian democracy, which had endured for centuries, came under strong Macedonian influence. Sparta, which had traditionally avoided alliances, was also forced to accept the new reality. The great cities, which had rivaled each other for centuries, now found themselves under the rule of a single ruler. After his victory at Chaeronea, Philip did not destroy the Greek city-states. Instead, he offered them a new form of unification. He created the League of Corinth, which included almost all the Greek states except Sparta. The goal of the League was to maintain peace within Greece and, most importantly, to organize a pan-Greek campaign against the Persian Empire, a longtime enemy of the Greeks. Philip positioned himself as the leader of this league, and the campaign against Persia as a holy war for the liberation of Greek cities under Persian rule. He began to prepare a massive army and navy, planning an invasion of the East. For many Greeks, this was an opportunity to avenge past grievances and regain their glory. Philip thus not only united Greece under his rule, but also directed its combined might against an external enemy. But fate decreed otherwise. On the eve of the start of the Eastern Campaign, in 1433 B.C., Philip II was assassinated. His young son Alexander, who was only 20 years old at the time, ascended the throne. Alexander III the Great, known to history as Alexander the Great, proved a worthy successor to his father. He inherited not only the throne, but also ambition, military talent, and a vision for the future. His early years were spent in an atmosphere of palace intrigue and military preparations. His education under Aristotle gave him a profound understanding of philosophy, science, and literature, which later manifested itself in his desire for knowledge and respect for other cultures. His ascension to the throne was not easy, but Alexander demonstrated determination and composure, quickly establishing his power. Immediately after his father's death, Alexander faced a wave of rebellions in Greece. Some city-states, especially Athens and Thebes, saw this as an opportunity to regain their lost independence. Alexander, however, acted swiftly and mercilessly. He suppressed all pockets of resistance, demonstrating that Macedonian rule would not tolerate disobedience. The fate of Thebes was particularly significant. This city, once one of Greece's leading centers, had dared to rebel against Macedonian hegemony. After a siege, Alexander ordered the city razed to the ground, sparing only a few survivors and selling the rest into slavery. Thebes served as a stern warning to other Greek city-states, confirming that Macedonian dominance was firmly established. This event strengthened Alexander's power and demonstrated his determination to pursue his goals to the end. After pacifying Greece, Alexander, faithful to his father's plan, began his Eastern campaign. In the spring of 1432 B.C., with an army of Macedonians and Greek allies, he crossed the Hellespont, the strait separating Europe from Asia. The first clashes with the Persian army occurred on the Granicus River. Despite their numerical superiority, the Macedonians achieved a brilliant victory, opening the way to Asia Minor. The next major battle took place at Issus, where Alexander clashed with the Persian king Darius III himself. Defeated, Darius fled, leaving his family and treasures behind. These initial victories demonstrated the military superiority of the Macedonian army and undermined the authority of the Persian Empire. The conquest of Asia Minor was relatively quick. Alexander, demonstrating not only military talent but also strategic thinking, moved forward, liberating Greek cities from Persian rule and annexing them to his kingdom. He then headed to Egypt, The Egyptians, tired of Persian rule, greeted him as a liberator. In Egypt, Alexander founded a city named Alexandria in his honor. This city became one of the greatest cultural and commercial centers of the ancient world. But before continuing his journey east, Alexander had to consolidate his position in his homeland, Greece. It was during this period that an event occurred that forever changed the course of Greek history: the Battle of Chaeronea. 1338 BC. This year marked a turning point. The Hellenic world, always proud of its independence and fragmentation into numerous self-governing city-states, or polis, found itself confronted by a new, previously unknown force. A force that arose in the north, in Macedonia. Macedonia, located north of Greece proper, was long perceived as a peripheral region. Its lands were harsher, and its culture less refined than those of the Athenian or Spartan agoras. However, thanks to its rulers, Macedonia gradually gained strength. Geography played a role. Vast forests produced valuable timber, fertile valleys grain, and mountainous regions ore. Early rulers such as Archelaus and Amyntas III laid the foundations of statehood, but Macedonia's true heyday began with the rise of Philip II. Philip II, who ascended the throne in 1438 BC, was a man of remarkable intellect and unwavering will. He understood that for Macedonia to survive and prosper, it was essential to become a strong power. His primary concern was the creation of a professional army. Unlike the city-state militias, which were assembled only for war, Philip's army was permanent. He introduced the famous Macedonian phalanx, armed with long spears called sarissas. These spears, up to 6 meters long, created an impenetrable wall that was nearly impossible to penetrate. He also devoted great attention to the discipline, training, and supply of his soldiers. Philip's military innovations went hand in hand with skillful diplomacy. He knew how to find allies, exploit differences between Greek city-states, and resort to bribery and marriage alliances. Macedonia gradually began to expand its influence. Philip united the disparate Macedonian tribes under his rule, fortified the borders, and repelled attacks from neighboring tribes such as the Thracians and Illyrians. His authority over Macedonia became uncontested. Philip then turned his attention south to Greece. Despite their cultural sophistication, Greek city-states frequently waged war against one another. This weakened them and made them vulnerable. Philip skillfully exploited this. He intervened in the Phocian War, a conflict between Delphi and other Greek states. The Macedonian army, demonstrating its might, played a decisive role in the war's outcome. This strengthened Philip's position in Greek affairs, and many city-states began to see him not only as a potential threat, but also as a guarantor of order. And so, in 1338 BC, near the city of Chaeronea in Boeotia, a clash occurred that would determine the fate of Greece for centuries to come. Philip's army confronted the combined forces of Athens and Thebes, the two largest and most influential city-states. The Athenians, once a maritime power whose democracy was a model for many, and the Thebans, renowned for their land-based armies, assembled their finest forces. Everyday life in those days was far removed from the glitter of palaces and the clash of arms. Most people lived in small houses, engaged in agriculture, crafts, or trade. Women tended to the home, raised children, and weaved. Men spent their time in the agora, discussing politics, haggling in the market, or training in the gymnasiums. But the Battle of Chaeronea touched everyone's lives. On the battlefield, Philip's Macedonian phalanx met the Greek warriors. Philip, in the center of his army, directed the action. The left wing of the Macedonian army, manned by the young heir to the throne, Alexander, played a key role. Alexander, despite his youth, displayed remarkable bravery and tactical genius. He successfully broke through the enemy lines, forcing them to retreat. The battle was intense, but the outcome was a foregone conclusion. The Macedonian army, better organized, disciplined, and armed, won a decisive victory. The Greek city-states were routed. This battle marked the end of the era of independent Greek city-states. Their centuries-long fragmentation and rivalry had led to the loss of their freedom. After the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip established his hegemony over Greece. He did not destroy cities, as a conqueror in a more brutal era would have done. Instead, he proposed a new order. In 1337 BC, at Philip's initiative, the League of Corinth was established. This was a confederation of Greek states under the leadership of Macedonia. The goal of the League was to maintain peace within Greece and, most importantly, to prepare for a pan-Greek campaign against a common enemy, the Persian Empire. Philip saw himself as the leader of this campaign, the heir to the ancient feud between Hellenes and barbarians. He dreamed of emulating the exploits of mythical heroes, defeating a powerful enemy, and bringing glory to the entire Hellenic world. But fate decreed otherwise. Before Philip could begin his grand campaign, he was assassinated in 1336 BC. His young son, Alexander, ascended the throne. After the decisive Battle of Chaeronea, when the independence of the Greek city-states was threatened, Philip of Macedon proposed a new path for Greece. He understood that the Greeks' disunity had always been their weakness, and now, by uniting them under his aegis, he sought to create a unified force. This aspiration resulted in the creation of the League of Corinth, founded in 1337 BC. The Corinthian League was not a conquest in the traditional sense. Philip did not seek to destroy or enslave the Greek cities. Instead, he offered them a new form of cooperation based on mutual interests and a common goal. The League united most of the Greek states, from the Peloponnese to Thessaly. Each city-state retained its internal autonomy, its own laws, and its own way of life. However, in matters of foreign policy and defense, they now acted together, under the leadership of Macedonia. An important aspect of the alliance was the establishment of peace within Greece. Previously, Greek city-states had frequently waged war against each other, depleting their resources and strength. The Corinthian League put an end to these internal strife, ushering in a new era of relative stability. Decisions were made at a general council, which included representatives from all the allied states. This council, like the alliance itself, was named the Corinthian Council, after the city where many important meetings took place. The main goal of the Corinthian League was to unite Greek forces for a common campaign against the Persian Empire. Philip, like many Greeks, remembered the devastation wrought by the Persians during the Greco-Persian Wars that had occurred over 100 years earlier. He saw Persia as a long-standing enemy of the Hellenic world, and his ambitions extended far beyond Greece. He dreamed of emulating the exploits of past heroes like Agamemnon and leading a pan-Hellenic army in a campaign to the east. For Philip, this was more than just a military campaign. It was an opportunity to unite the Greeks under a common banner, assert his leadership, and bring glory to the entire Greek world. He saw himself not simply as the king of Macedonia, but also as the defender of Hellenic civilization from external threats. He began actively preparing for this grandiose undertaking. Huge reserves of food and weapons were amassed, a fleet was built, and the army underwent intensive training. Imagine what life was like at that time. In small towns and villages, people went about their daily business. Peasants toiled in the fields, growing grain, olives, and grapes. Craftsmen in workshops created pottery, weapons, and textiles. The cities were bustling with activity. The agora, the main square, was a hive of trade and lively conversation. Philosophers pondered the nature of things. Poets composed verses, and playwrights prepared new plays for the theater. But above all this, there was a sense of anticipation, of something great, something to come. News of preparations for the campaign against Persia spread throughout Greece. Some greeted it with delight, seeing it as an opportunity to reclaim lost glory and bring wealth from the east. Others were uneasy, fearing new wars and destruction. Nevertheless, Philip's strength and diplomatic talent had their effect. Most Greek city-states agreed to join the alliance. Philip was a skilled politician. He knew how to find common ground with different people, persuade, and find compromises. He used both force and diplomacy to achieve his goals. For example, he formed alliances with some states and negotiated favorable terms with others. He understood that to successfully campaign against Persia, he needed not only a strong army, but also the support of the entire Hellenic world. And so, when all preparations were complete, when the Greek city-states united under the auspices of the Corinthian League, when the army was ready to set out, fate intervened in Philip's plans. In 1336 BC, during the celebration of his daughter's wedding, Philip was assassinated. This was an unexpected blow to the entire Hellenic world and to the Macedonian kingdom itself. But the empire built by Philip proved resilient. His son, Alexander, a young man who had already distinguished himself in military campaigns, ascended the throne. He inherited not only the throne, but also his father's ambitions. And now he was to complete what had been started, lead a pan-Greek campaign against the Persian Empire, and change the course of history. Philip's legacy, his reforms, and his vision of a united Greece laid the foundation for future great achievements. Thus, we have reached the moment when the world of Hellenic city-states, once divided and disunited, was preparing for a great unification under the leadership of Macedonia. Philip II, this outstanding ruler, managed to weave together the threads of politics, diplomacy, and military force, laying the foundation for a grand campaign to the east. His life ended abruptly, leaving behind not only imperial ambitions, but also a young heir destined to realize his father's dream. Our story now turns to Alexander, the third of that name, heir to the Macedonian Empire. His life, which began in 1364 BC, was marked from the very beginning by grandeur and responsibility. Alexander was born in Pella, the capital of Macedonia, to King Philip II and his fourth wife Olympias, daughter of the king of Epirus. From his earliest childhood, he was surrounded by an atmosphere of power, military preparations, and philosophical conversations. Young Alexander's education was truly exceptional. His teacher was none other than the greatest philosopher of his time, Aristotle. For 3 years, from 1351 to 1348 BC, Aristotle taught Alexander in Mysa, near Pella. His lessons covered a wide range of subjects: philosophy, ethics, politics, as well as literature, poetry, and, of course, history. Alexander eagerly absorbed knowledge, particularly captivated by the works of Homer, especially the Iliad. He carried a copy of the poem, which, according to legend, Aristotle had specially prepared for him, and considered Achilles his ideal. This education not only developed his intellect, but also shaped his worldview, laying the foundations for his future achievements. In addition to his academic studies, Alexander underwent military training from a young age. His father, Philip II, groomed him from the very beginning for the role of successor and commander. Alexander accompanied his father on military campaigns, observed tactics, and participated in battles. At the age of 16, when Philip set out on another campaign, the young Alexander was left as governor of Macedonia and governed the country, showing the first signs of his statesmanship. At 17, he commanded the cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea, where he demonstrated courage and determination. These early experiences forged his character and prepared him for future trials. In 1336 BC, as we already mentioned, Philip II was assassinated. This tragic news reached Alexander in Larissa, where he was attending the wedding of his sister Cleopatra. His father's murder was a shock, but the young Alexander did not panic. He acted quickly and decisively. Returning to Pella, he immediately took measures to secure his power. Potential claimants to the throne and anyone he considered a threat were executed. At the age of 20, in 1334 BC, Alexander was proclaimed King of Macedonia. His ascension to the throne occurred during a difficult period. Macedonian hegemony over Greece had been established, but not unconditionally accepted by all city-states. Within the Hellenic world itself, pockets of discontent and a desire for independence remained. Furthermore, warlike tribes lived to the north and west of Macedonia, always posing a threat. Alexander understood that to preserve his father's legacy and realize his grandiose plans, he first needed to consolidate his power and demonstrate his strength. The first test for the young king was the revolt in Greece. News of Philip's death and the accession of the young Alexander raised hopes among those seeking independence. In Athens, for example, heated debates erupted. The orator Demosthenes, a longtime opponent of Macedonian influence, called for resistance. Militias began to form across Greece. However, Alexander acted with lightning speed. He didn't wait for the scattered uprisings to coalesce into a unified rebellion. He gathered an army and marched south. His appearance was so unexpected that many cities, already preparing for war, were unprepared for his approach. The fate of Thebes was of particular importance to Alexander. This ancient and powerful city, located in Boeotia, had always been distinguished by its independence and pride. During the Phocian War and subsequent events, Thebes repeatedly sided with Macedonia's enemies. Now, sensing the weakening of Macedonian control, the Thebans revolted. They expelled the Macedonian garrison and began preparing for defense. Alexander approached Thebes with an army. He offered the city's surrender, but the Thebans refused. They trusted in their own strength and in the aid of other Greek city-states, which, however, never arrived in sufficient numbers. Alexander laid siege to the city. The siege was short but fierce. The Macedonian army, battle-hardened under Philip's leadership, demonstrated great combat effectiveness. In 1335 BC, just a year after Philip's death, Thebes was taken by storm. The fate of Thebes became a harsh lesson for all of Greece. Alexander, wishing to suppress any further resistance and demonstrate his resolve, ordered the city's destruction. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, who was particularly revered, were spared. The city's inhabitants were sold into slavery. The destruction of Thebes had a profound effect on the Greek city-states. Fear of Macedonian power and Alexander's resolve spread throughout the country. Many cities that had recently wavered now hastened to declare their loyalty. Athens, for example, was forced to send an embassy with apologies and reaffirm its membership in the League of Corinth. Thus, within just 1 year of his accession to the throne, Alexander III the Great managed not only to retain power, but also to consolidate Macedonian hegemony over Greece, suppressing pockets of resistance and instilling fear in his opponents. He proved himself a worthy successor to his father, capable of both waging war and governing the state. Now that Greece was under his control and his internal affairs settled, Alexander could fully concentrate on the great campaign to the east bequeathed to him by Philip. The world waited in anticipation. So, we left off with Alexander, the young king of Macedonia, managing to consolidate his power over Greece within just a year of his accession. After suppressing internal unrest in Macedonia itself, he turned his attention to the south, where independent Greek city-states, despite the creation of the Corinthian League under Macedonian auspices, retained a certain degree of autonomy and, at times, expressed discontent. One such center of resistance was Thebes, one of the oldest and most influential cities in Boeotia. The Thebans, known for their pride and warlike spirit, always strove for independence. They repeatedly challenged the dominance of other Greek powers, whether Sparta or Athens. And now, with Philip II, Alexander's father, assassinated, and the young king still asserting his authority, the Thebans saw an opportunity to regain their lost influence. In 1335 BC, while Alexander was busy suppressing rebellions in the north, a rebellion broke out in Thebes. The city's inhabitants, perhaps inspired by memories of their past victories and counting on the weakness of the young ruler, decided to rebel against Macedonian hegemony. They believed they could regain the freedom guaranteed to them by the alliance. However, Alexander, although young, was no less decisive and experienced in military affairs than his father. Upon receiving news of the Theban revolt, he immediately moved his army south. His speed was astonishing. The Macedonian army, accustomed to rapid marches and surprise attacks, covered hundreds of kilometers in a matter of days. When Alexander's army approached Thebes, the city had not yet fully prepared for defense. The Macedonian king's astonishing speed caught the Thebans off guard. The siege began. It was short but fierce. The Macedonian army, battle-hardened under Philip's leadership, demonstrated high combat effectiveness. They employed siege engines that had already proven themselves effective under Philip. In 1335 BC, just a year after Philip's death, Thebes was stormed. Thebes' fate became a harsh lesson for all of Greece. Alexander, wishing to crush any further resistance and demonstrate his resolve, ordered the city destroyed. Only the temples, symbols of divine protection, and the house of the poet Pindar, who was particularly revered for his works celebrating Greek victories, were spared. The city's inhabitants, in accordance with ancient custom, were sold into slavery. The destruction of Thebes had a profound effect on the Greek city-states. Fear of Macedonian might and Alexander's resolve spread widely. Many cities that had recently hesitated now hastened to declare their loyalty. Athens, for example, was forced to send an embassy of apologies and reaffirm its membership in the Corinthian League. This demonstrated that any attempts at disobedience would be dealt with extreme brutality. Thus, within just 1 year of his accession to the throne, Alexander III the Great managed not only to retain power, but also to consolidate Macedonian hegemony over Greece, suppressing pockets of resistance and instilling fear in his opponents. He proved himself a worthy successor to his father, capable of both waging war and governing the state. Now that Greece was under his control and his internal affairs settled, Alexander could fully concentrate on the great campaign to the east bequeathed to him by Philip. The world waited in anticipation. This event, the destruction of Thebes, signaled the beginning of a new era in Greek history. The era of independent, sovereign city-states, which for centuries had defined the political landscape of the Hellenic world, was drawing to an end. In their place arose a new power, united under the rule of Macedonia. This power was young, energetic, and ambitious. Alexander, now fully confident of his power over Greece, turned his gaze to the east. His goal was grandiose, the conquest of the vast Persian Empire. This empire, weakened by internal strife and wars, seemed vulnerable. Nevertheless, it was an undertaking of unprecedented scale. Before setting out on his campaign, Alexander took a number of measures to ensure the security of his domains. He appointed governors in Greece to maintain order and collect taxes. He also ensured that his army was fully equipped and prepared for the long campaign. It's important to understand that life in the Greek city-states on the eve of this great expedition was very diverse. In large cities like Athens, cultural and political life continued to flourish. Philosophers, playwrights, and artists created works that have survived for millennia. Meanwhile, in smaller city-states, life was simpler, focused on agriculture and crafts. But all Greeks were united by a sense of belonging to a single Hellenic culture. A common language, common gods, common myths and heroes. All this created a strong bond between disparate city-states. And now, under the influence of Macedonian hegemony, this bond was about to take on a new, broader dimension. Alexander, himself a Macedonian, understood the importance of Greek culture perfectly. He received an excellent education, and his teacher was Aristotle himself. This meant he was not just a conqueror, but also a man who valued and understood Greek civilization. His decision to go east wasn't simply a desire for conquest. It was also a desire to expand the boundaries of the Greek world, spreading its culture and influence. It was a dream of a unified world where the Greek language and Greek ideas would dominate. So, after Thebes had been pacified and all of Greece was under Alexander's control, the moment had arrived when the Macedonian king could finally begin implementing the grand plan inherited from his father. The campaign to the east was ready to begin. The world, as we have already said, stood in anticipation. Before we move on to the campaign itself, it's worth noting that at this time, the Persian Empire, Greece's main adversary, was also undergoing its own transformations. The empire founded by Cyrus the Great was vast and multinational. It stretched from Egypt to India and was ruled from capitals such as Susa and Persepolis. However, by the end of the 4th century BC, the Persian Empire began to experience internal difficulties. A succession of kings, palace intrigues, and rebellions in remote satrapies all weakened its power. The Persian army, though numerous, no longer possessed the same fighting capacity as before. It was precisely this weakening that Philip, and now Alexander, had been counting on. They saw Persia not so much as an invincible enemy, but as a weakened giant that could be overthrown. Alexander faced the task not only of raising an army, but also of securing the support of his Greek allies. The League of Corinth, established by Philip, was to become the foundation for this pan-Greek campaign. Alexander understood that to succeed, he needed not only Macedonian strength, but also the consent and participation of all Greeks. He sent ambassadors to various city-states, urging them to cooperate. He spoke of his duty to the Hellenic world, the need to avenge past Persian invasions, and the possibility of bringing Greek civilization to the eastern lands. His words resonated. Fear of Persia, though weakened, still lingered, and the prospect of glory and booty lured many. Thus, gradually, an army was formed that would change the course of history. Alexander, a strategist, foresaw all the potential difficulties. He knew the Persians would put up fierce resistance. He understood the campaign would be long and grueling. But he also believed in his star, in the strength of his army, and in the righteousness of his cause. Thus, the suppression of the Greek rebellions, culminating in the destruction of Thebes, became the final step before Alexander could fully devote himself to his primary goal, the Eastern campaign. This was the transition from internal consolidation to external expansion, from asserting power to world conquest. And this transition was marked by decisiveness, speed, and, unfortunately for Thebes, brutality. But it was precisely these qualities that enabled Alexander, the young king, to begin his great journey, which forever changed the map of the ancient world. So we have reached the moment when the young King Alexander, having established his power and consolidated the Greek city-states under his command, was ready to launch a great campaign to the east. This was the beginning of a new era, an era that would forever change the course of history. In the spring of 1334 BC, Alexander and his army set out from Pella, the capital of Macedonia. Before him lay the vast Persian Empire, stretching from the shores of the Aegean Sea to India. It was a challenge that required not only military might, but also tremendous resolve. The route to Asia Minor lay through the Hellespont, today's Dardanelles. It was a symbolic crossing. The Greeks, who had once defended their lands from Persian invasions, were now invading enemy territory. Alexander, standing on the shore, looked out over the waters of the strait. His army numbered approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. These were experienced warriors trained under Philip. Among them were Macedonian phalangites armed with long spears called sarissas, hypaspists, lightly armed infantrymen, and, of course, the famous hetairoi, Macedonian cavalry, elite horsemen who formed the army's striking force. The crossing of the Hellespont took several days. The troops were transported on ships drawn from various Greek city-states, now united under Alexander's command. After landing on the Asian shore, Alexander performed a ritual, throwing a spear into the ground. This symbolized his claim to Asian land. He also made sacrifices to the gods, praying for favor in the coming battles. The first major clash with the Persian forces occurred at the Granicus River in western Asia Minor in 1334 BC. The Persian army was commanded by local satraps or governors, subordinate to the Persian king Darius III. Their force was large but poorly organized. They occupied a favorable position on the high riverbank, intending to prevent the Macedonians from crossing. Alexander, as always, displayed courage and determination. He personally led the attack. Despite intense arrow and missile fire, the Macedonian cavalry, supported by infantry, crossed the river. The battle was fierce. The Macedonians, thanks to their discipline and superior tactics, were able to break through the Persian lines. The companions especially distinguished themselves, outflanking the Persians and delivering a decisive blow. The Persian army was routed, suffering heavy losses. This victory opened the way for Alexander to advance deeper into Asia Minor. After the Battle of Granicus, Alexander continued his advance. He sought to liberate the Greek cities under Persian rule. Many of them voluntarily opened their gates to the Macedonian army, seeing them as liberators. Alexander treated these cities with respect, preserving their self-government and traditions. He understood that for long-term dominance, he needed support, not just fear. However, not all cities surrendered without a fight. For example, the city of Halicarnassus put up a stubborn resistance. Here, the Persian fleet and mercenary Greek infantry under the command of Memnon, a talented Greek commander in Persian service, managed to organize a defense. Alexander laid siege to the city, and the fighting was back and forth. The siege was long and bloody, but eventually the Macedonians took the city. Meanwhile, the Persian king Darius III had assembled a new, even larger army. He decided to personally lead his troops to stop Alexander. In 1333 BC, the armies of Alexander and Darius met at the Battle of Issus in southern Asia Minor. It was one of the most significant battles in history. The Persian army was significantly larger than the Macedonian. Estimates range from 100 to 200,000 warriors, while Alexander's army numbered around 40,000. Darius deployed his forces on the plain, where his numerous cavalry could operate more freely. He hoped to encircle and destroy Alexander's army. Alexander, as before, demonstrated outstanding military leadership. He knew that the enemy's numerical superiority had to be countered with tactics. He positioned his phalanx in the center, with his cavalry on the flanks. Alexander himself, as always, stood at the head of the hetairoi, preparing for the decisive blow. The battle began with a Persian cavalry attack on the Macedonian flanks. However, the Macedonians held firm. Then Alexander, seeing an opportunity, led his hetairoi in a charge directly into the center of the Persian lines, where Darius himself was stationed. It was a daring maneuver. The Persian ranks faltered. When Darius saw his personal guard surrounded, he fled the battlefield in panic. His flight spread panic throughout the Persian army, and it was dispersed. The victory at Issus was crushing. The Macedonians lost relatively few soldiers, while the Persians suffered enormous losses. It's important to note that Alexander captured Darius's mother, wife, and children. Alexander, however, showed nobility. He treated them with respect, providing them with a decent living. He said that if Darius himself came to him, he would forgive him. This was an example of his diplomatic approach, which often accompanied his military successes. After the Battle of Issus, the path to conquering the Persian Empire was clear. Alexander moved further south toward Phoenicia and Egypt. These regions were rich and strategically important. Conquering these lands allowed Alexander to strengthen his position and deprive Persia of vital resources and ports. He understood that control of the Mediterranean was essential for further advancement. At this point in our journey into the past, we see how a young king, just 20 years old, managed to turn the tide of events. The beginning of the Eastern Campaign, marked by the crossing of the Hellespont and brilliant victories at Granicus and Issus, marked the first step toward the creation of one of the most extensive empires of antiquity. These events were not simply military clashes, but also the beginning of profound cultural and political changes, which we will explore further. After a brilliant victory at Issus, where the young Alexander had the opportunity to confront the Persian king Darius in person, the route south opened. The Persian Empire, once seemingly invincible, now felt the Macedonian army's influence. Alexander, guided by strategic vision, headed for the rich and vital lands of Phoenicia and Egypt. These regions, located along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, were not only a source of wealth, but also the key to control of the sea routes. Phoenicia, with its flourishing city-states such as Tyre and Sidon, was renowned for its skilled seafarers and traders. Situated on an island, Tyre was a veritable fortress. Its siege, which began in 1321 BCE, proved one of the most difficult trials for the Macedonian army. Alexander ordered the construction of a causeway connecting the mainland to the island, allowing him to transport siege weapons and launch an assault. The Tyrians put up a fierce resistance, but after a 7-month siege, the city fell. This victory secured Alexander control of the Phoenician fleet, one of the largest of its time, and opened the way to Egypt. Egypt, the ancient land of the pharaohs, greeted Alexander not as a conqueror, but rather as a liberator. The local population, tired of Persian rule, saw new hope in the Macedonian king. In 1320 BC, Alexander entered Egypt without a fight. He was warmly received in Memphis, the ancient capital, and the priests proclaimed him pharaoh. This was more than just a symbolic act. It gave Alexander legitimacy and the support of the influential Egyptian clergy. It was in Egypt, on the banks of the Nile, that Alexander decided to found a new city. This location was no accident. It was located at the crossroads of trade routes, had access to the sea and fertile land, and boasted a convenient harbor. The city was named Alexandria in honor of its founder. Construction of Alexandria began in 1320 BC. The city was designed according to the principles of Greek urban planning, with streets, an agora, theaters, and temples. Alexandria quickly became a major economic and cultural center, uniting Greek and Egyptian civilizations. The famous Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and the Library of Alexandria, which became the largest repository of knowledge in antiquity, were built here. The conquest of Asia Minor and Egypt was of enormous strategic importance. Alexander didn't simply expand his dominion. He laid the foundations for a new era. Control of these territories deprived Persia of vital resources, its navy and ports, making further resistance virtually impossible. Egypt, with its rich grain reserves, ensured food security for the Macedonian army, and the Phoenician fleet allowed Alexander to control sea lanes. Life in the conquered lands gradually changed. Greek settlers began arriving in Asia Minor and Egypt, bringing with them their customs, language, and culture. However, Alexander did not seek to completely eradicate local traditions. He respected the beliefs and customs of the conquered peoples, often incorporating elements of them into his own culture. This facilitated a smoother and less conflictual process of assimilation. In the cities founded by Alexander, such as Alexandria, Greek language and culture became the language of the elite and commerce, but local languages and traditions continued to exist. The daily lives of the conquered peoples certainly faced difficulties. Tax collection, the restructuring of the administrative system, and the deployment of Macedonian garrisons all created a certain tension. However, overall, Alexander's policy was aimed at integration rather than suppression. He appointed local satraps, preserving elements of the previous administration, and sought cooperation. For peasants and artisans, life could continue to be relatively stable if they paid taxes and submitted to the new authorities. Trade routes disrupted during the wars were gradually restored, bringing economic recovery. The conquest of these key territories was not just a military triumph, but also the beginning of profound cultural and economic transformations. Alexander, a young king whose reign had begun only a few years earlier, had already redrew the map of the ancient world. His actions in Phoenicia and Egypt, the founding of Alexandria, all these were steps that determined the future not only of his empire, but of the entire Mediterranean region for centuries to come. The road to complete victory over the Persian Empire was still long, but the foundation for it had been firmly laid. After conquering Egypt and founding Alexandria, Alexander the Great faced the task of finally crushing the resistance of the Persian Empire. The next step was to advance deep into Asia to meet the main Persian army under the command of King Darius III himself. This was a long journey and required careful preparation. Alexander understood that in the open, against a large army, he had to fight a decisive battle to dash the Persians' last hopes. In 1331 BC, at the end of summer, Alexander and his army left Egypt and moved east. He sought to secure favorable positions for battle while avoiding overextending his forces. The Persian army, by contrast, was assembled in vast numbers, by some estimates numbering hundreds of thousands of warriors. Darius III, seeking to secure an advantage, chose the plain near the city of Gaugamela, located in Mesopotamia, in what is now the Republic of Iraq, for battle. This plain was spacious enough for the Persians to deploy their entire force, including chariots and elephants, which they used as a shock force. Upon arriving, Alexander carefully surveyed the terrain. He realized that his army, although superior in discipline and training to the Persians, was significantly outnumbered. Therefore, he didn't wait for the Persians to attack first, but took up a defensive position, choosing a field that would limit the enemy army's maneuverability. He deployed infantry in front of his troops and cavalry on the flanks. A distinctive feature of the Macedonian army was the phalanx, a formation of infantrymen armed with long spears that formed an impenetrable wall. The flanks were protected by elite cavalry, the famous heteroi, Alexander's personal guard. The morning of the Battle of Gaugamela, which took place in the first month of autumn in 1331 BC, was foggy. This played into Alexander's hands, as the fog could obscure the movements of his troops and create some confusion among the Persian ranks. When the fog cleared, the Macedonians were met with a truly magnificent spectacle. The Persian army spread out for miles with bright banners and glittering weapons. The battle began with a Persian cavalry charge. However, the Macedonians were prepared. Their formation held firm, and they were able to repel the initial attacks. Then Alexander, leading the shock cavalry, charged into the thick of the battle, aiming for the center of the Persian formation, where he knew Darius himself was located. It was a bold and risky maneuver, but it proved to be the turning point. The Persian soldiers, seeing their king and the center of the army under attack, began to waver. Many of them, concerned for their own safety, began to abandon their positions. Darius III, realizing the battle was lost, also fled. His flight caused panic among the Persian ranks, and the army began to disintegrate. The Macedonians pursued the fugitives, but Alexander, as usual, sought to capture rather than destroy them. The Battle of Gaugamela was not just another battle, but the true climax of Alexander's conquests. It was a decisive victory that effectively ended the Achaemenid Persian Empire. As a result of this battle, Darius III lost his army, his throne, and, ultimately, his life. Alexander, however, gained complete control over vast territories of Persia, from Asia Minor to Mesopotamia. Immediately after the battle, Alexander marched on Babylon, one of the empire's largest cities. The Babylonians, not wanting to suffer the same fate as Thebes, opened their gates to Alexander. He was greeted as a liberator, not a conqueror. He entered the city without shedding a drop of blood, and occupied the royal palace. Other major Persian cities followed: Susa, the empire's capital, and Persepolis, its ceremonial center. In Susa, Alexander seized vast treasures, which helped him finance further campaigns. Persepolis, though largely destroyed, held a rich cultural heritage. The conquest of the Persian Empire was a monumental event that changed the course of history. It led to the spread of Greek culture and language across vast territories, marking the beginning of the so-called Hellenistic world. This was a period when Greek ideas, art, and philosophy mingled with local traditions, creating a new, unique civilization. Few could have imagined that a young Macedonian king, who began his career in a small kingdom in northern Greece, would be able to overthrow such a powerful empire. His victories led to unprecedented cultural exchange and left an indelible mark on human history. After his monumental victory at Gaugamela, which, as we've already mentioned, effectively ended the Achaemenid Persian Empire, Alexander the Great didn't stop there. Darius III, having lost his army and throne, fled east, attempting to gather the remnants of his forces. Alexander, as we know, marched on Babylon, where he was met without resistance. Susa and Persepolis followed. In Susa, as we've already mentioned, enormous treasures were seized, which undoubtedly played a significant role in funding his subsequent campaigns. Now, after the fall of the main capitals, Alexander faced the task of completely subjugating the vast territories that had recently constituted the Persian Empire. This was a complex and lengthy process. Darius III, although crushingly defeated, still posed a potential threat as long as he was alive and enjoyed the support of some eastern satraps. Therefore, pursuing Darius became a top priority. Alexander and part of his army marched deep into the empire, into the eastern satrapies, hot on the heels of the fugitive king. This was a journey through lands far less familiar to the Greeks than Asia Minor or Egypt. Here stretched vast steppes, mountain ranges, and desert plateaus. The journey was fraught with difficulties: the climate, the unfamiliar terrain, and the need to maintain discipline in an army that had already endured numerous battles and long marches. At this time, somewhere in what is now Afghanistan or Central Asia, Darius III was assassinated. This happened not in battle, but as a result of a conspiracy. He was murdered by his own confidants, the satraps Bessus, Artabazus, and others. They did this, believing they could reach an agreement with Alexander by offering him the Persian king's body and perhaps retain their position. Bessus, in particular, proclaimed himself the new king, attempting to continue the resistance. When Alexander learned of Darius's death, according to ancient sources, he expressed grief. He ordered Darius's body to be found and buried with royal honors. This was not only an act of respect for the defeated enemy, but also an important political step. Alexander sought to present himself to the conquered peoples not simply as a conqueror, but as a legitimate successor who respected traditions and customs. In this way, he sought to legitimize his power in the eyes of the inhabitants of the former Persian Empire. After Darius's death, formal resistance as a unified Persian force was broken. However, this did not mean the end of hostilities. Bessus and other rebellious satraps continued their resistance. Alexander was forced to wage campaigns against them. These were years of difficult campaigns, often amid guerrilla warfare or localized uprisings. The Macedonian army, accustomed to fighting on open fields, now faced new challenges. One such campaign was the pursuit of Bessus. Alexander traveled to Bactria and Sogdiana, territories located in the northeast of the empire. These lands were characterized by a harsh climate and mountainous terrain, which hampered the army's movements. Here, Alexander encountered strong resistance from local tribes who refused to submit to either the Persian or Macedonian rulers. In these regions, Alexander demonstrated not only his military, but also his engineering skills. He ordered the construction of roads, bridges, and fortified camps. New cities were founded to serve as centers of Macedonian power and Greek culture. One such city, Alexandria Eschkata, meaning Alexandria the Farther, was founded on the Jaxartes River, modern-day Syr Darya, at the very edge of the then-known world. Meanwhile, in the rear, the fortification of the conquered territories continued. The administrators appointed by Alexander tried to establish an administrative system, collect taxes, and maintain order. The inhabitants of the conquered lands, in turn, gradually became accustomed to the new government. Some, especially in the large cities, found benefit in the establishment of Greek order and the development of trade and crafts. Others, especially in rural areas, continued to live their normal lives, trying to avoid interference from the new administration. It's important to understand that the conquest of the Persian Empire wasn't a single event. It was a process that spanned several years and required a tremendous amount of effort from Alexander and his army. After Gaugamela, as we've already mentioned, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis were captured. Then came the pursuit of Darius, his assassination, and finally campaigns against rebellious satraps in the eastern parts of the empire. These campaigns were fraught with difficulties. Alexander encountered resistance not only from the remnants of the Persian nobility, but also from local peoples fighting for their independence. For example, in Sogdiana and Bactria, he encountered commanders such as Spitamenes, who led a popular uprising and inflicted several defeats on the Macedonians. During these campaigns, Alexander also demonstrated his ability to adapt. He began to utilize local military tactics, recruit local warriors, and adopt some elements of Eastern administrative styles, and even clothing. This caused discontent among some of his Macedonian companions, who believed that Alexander was becoming too Easternized. The key moment in completing the conquest of Persia was the final suppression of resistance and the establishment of Macedonian rule over all of its former territories. Bessus, as the main culprit in Darius's murder and the organizer of the resistance, was eventually captured, tried, and executed. This symbolically concluded the period of struggle for the Achaemenid legacy. The conquest of the Persian Empire, begun by Philip II and continued by Alexander, was more than just a military triumph. It ushered in a new era in the history of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Greek culture, language, and ideas began to spread across vast territories, mingling with local traditions. This marked the beginning of the so-called Hellenistic world, a period that would last for centuries and leave an indelible mark on human history. Thus, the completion of the conquest of the Persian Empire was the result of long and arduous campaigns, filled with both brilliant victories and serious trials. Alexander, pursuing Darius and suppressing resistance, effectively became the heir to one of the greatest empires of antiquity, paving the way for unprecedented cultural exchange and the formation of a new Hellenistic world. Having reached the eastern reaches of the once mighty Persian Empire, Alexander did not stop there. His gaze turned further to lands the Greeks knew only from travelers' tales and myths. This was the region known as India, a land full of mysteries and unseen wonders. The expedition to these lands became one of the most ambitious and, at the same time, most grueling stages of his great campaign. The route to India lay through harsh mountain passes and scorching deserts. Alexander led his army, composed of seasoned Macedonian veterans, Greek mercenaries, and allied nations, through lands where even the climate was hostile. The summer heat was unbearable, and the winter frosts in the mountains rivaled the harsh northern winters. The troops suffered from thirst, hunger, and disease. Every step forward required colossal effort. One of the key moments in the Indian campaign was the crossing of the Indus River. Here, Alexander encountered a new adversary, King Porus, ruler of one of the powerful kingdoms in what is now Punjab. Porus was renowned for his courage and strength. He assembled a sizable army, including not only infantry and cavalry, but also war elephants, a formidable weapon the Greek warriors had never encountered on such a large scale. The battle with Porus took place near the Hydaspes River in 1326 BC. This battle proved to be one of Alexander's most difficult. The elephants, charging, sowed panic among the Macedonian ranks. The horses, frightened by their roar and appearance, became uncontrollable. However, thanks to Alexander's tactical genius and the resilience of his warriors, they managed to overcome this obstacle. The Macedonians used special techniques to disable the elephants and achieved victory. Despite his defeat, King Porus proved himself a worthy adversary. Alexander, impressed by his courage and nobility, not only spared his life, but also allowed him to rule his lands, making him his vassal. This act of mercy and respect for his defeated enemy was further evidence of Alexander's complex character, which was not only a conqueror, but also a politician with a knack for diplomacy. After the Battle of the Hydaspes, Alexander's army continued its advance into India. They passed through fertile valleys where life was completely different from the lands familiar to the Greeks. The local population practiced agriculture, growing rice and other crops unfamiliar to the Greeks. Their houses were built of clay and wood, and their clothing was made of cotton. Life here was simple and subordinated to the rhythm of nature. However, the further Alexander advanced into India, the more discontent grew among his soldiers. 20 years of continuous campaigns, thousands of miles covered, countless battles, all this had exhausted the army. The soldiers, battle-hardened but exhausted by their long absence from home and constant hardships, began to grumble. They yearned for their families, their hometowns, and a peaceful life. The turning point came upon reaching the Hyphasis River. Here, according to historians, Alexander intended to continue his campaign, but encountered open defiance from his troops. The warriors, gathering together, refused to advance further. They declared that they had reached the limit of their strength and could no longer continue this grueling march. Their pleas and demands were so compelling that even Alexander, renowned for his unbending will, was forced to yield. This was Alexander's first and perhaps only serious defeat, inflicted not by the enemy army, but by the fatigue and despair of his own soldiers. He spent 3 days in his tent, lost in thought. Then, emerging before his troops, he announced his decision to turn back. It was a difficult decision, but it preserved the army and prevented its complete disintegration. The return journey was no less difficult than the one ahead. Alexander divided his army into 2 parts. The main force, under the command of Nearchus, set out by sea, sailing along the coast of the Indian Ocean. This naval expedition was fraught with enormous difficulties: storms, unknown shores, and hostile local tribes. Nearchus and his men had to demonstrate incredible resilience and ingenuity to survive and complete their mission. The other part of the army, including Alexander himself, marched overland through the Gedrosia Desert. It was one of the most merciless regions they had ever encountered. The desert was shrouded in impenetrable heat. The sand burned their feet, and water was at a premium. Many soldiers died of dehydration and exhaustion. Alexander, sharing the hardships of his soldiers, personally led them through this inhospitable land. He even ordered his officers, who were carrying water on mules, to give their supplies to the common soldiers, setting an example of self-sacrifice. During this period, when the army was on the verge of complete exhaustion, Alexander proved himself not only a great commander, but also a leader capable of inspiring and leading his men even in the most hopeless situations. He understood that his strength lay in his army, and its well-being was paramount to him. During their stay in India, Alexander and his learned companions collected valuable information about the local flora and fauna, the region's geography, and the customs of its people. They described previously unseen animals such as rhinoceroses and tigers, and plants that did not grow in Greece. This knowledge, gathered during the Indian campaign, enriched the Greeks' understanding of the world around them and contributed to the further development of science. The Indian campaign, despite its difficulties and limited territorial gains, was of immense significance. It expanded the boundaries of the known world for the Greeks, introducing them to new cultures and civilizations. Alexander, seeking new horizons, led his men where no Hellenic warrior had gone before. It was a journey that stretched the limits of human endurance, testing the strength of both the army and its commander. The army's fatigue was real and palpable. The soldiers, who had endured numerous battles and campaigns, dreamed of returning home. Their fighting spirit, forged in battles with the Persians, had been sapped by the grueling Indian campaign. Alexander, recognizing this, decided to end his eastern expansion. He realized that further advance could lead to the complete collapse of his army. The return from India was long and difficult. Along the way, Alexander encountered new challenges, including resistance from some local tribes. However, after crossing the Gedrosia Desert and successfully completing Nearchus's naval expedition, the main body of the army was reunited. The expedition to India thus became the culmination of Alexander's campaigns of conquest. It demonstrated the limits of his ambitions and the capabilities of his army. This region, full of mysteries and dangers, became the last great frontier he crossed. Although he did not conquer all of India, his campaign left an indelible mark on history, expanding the Greeks' understanding of the world and bringing them new knowledge. This stage of Alexander's journey was not simply a military campaign, but also an educational expedition that enriched the world of antiquity. Our journey through the era of Macedonian ascendancy is drawing to a close. We've come a long way, beginning with the scattered Greek city-states and peripheral Macedonia, and culminating in the grand conquests of Alexander the Great. Now that the storm of battle has died down and the dust of the great campaigns has settled, we can calmly look back and see the legacy this era left behind. The return of Alexander and his army from India, though marked by trials, symbolized the end of his campaigns of conquest. It was the limit beyond which lay only new, unknown lands. The Indian campaign, which began in 326 BC, was not only a demonstration of military might, but also a bridge between worlds. It expanded the horizons of the Hellenistic world, introducing it to cultures that had previously existed only in myths and legends. But the true legacy of Alexander's conquests lies not only in the conquered territories. It manifested itself in how these territories began to change, how Greek culture began to penetrate the most remote corners of the East, and how the East, in turn, enriched the Greek world. This was not simply a one-sided process. It was the beginning of a new, astonishing synthesis that we call the Hellenistic period. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, his vast empire fragmented into several kingdoms. These kingdoms, known as diadochi, were ruled by his generals. But even amid this disintegration, Greek culture, language, and way of life continued to spread. Cities founded by Alexander, such as Alexandria in Egypt, became centers of learning, art, and trade, blending Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and other Eastern traditions. Koine, A simplified form of Greek became the lingua franca of the entire Hellenistic world. It allowed people from different cultures to communicate, trade, and exchange ideas. Greek philosophy, literature, science, and art had a profound influence on the development of these new civilizations. Scholars in Alexandria studied the stars, mathematics, and medicine, drawing on the achievements of both the Greeks and the ancient Egyptians. This cultural synthesis was not always peaceful, but it was inevitable. It created a new, cosmopolitan civilization that lasted for several centuries. The Hellenistic kingdoms, although politically fragmented, were united by a common cultural space. This space became the foundation for further development, and its influence was felt even centuries later. The Macedonian conquest, begun by Philip II and continued by his son Alexander, marked the end of the era of independent Greek city-states in their previous form. The Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC marked a turning point, establishing Macedonian hegemony. The League of Corinth, founded by Philip, united the Greeks under a single leadership, albeit with varying degrees of voluntariness. However, instead of destroying Greek culture, Macedonian rule, paradoxically, facilitated its spread. Alexander, a student of Aristotle, was himself a bearer of this culture. He sought not only to conquer, but also to unite. The cities he founded became beacons of Greek civilization in the East. The long-term consequences of the Macedonian conquest were enormous. It paved the way for the Roman Empire, which inherited and continued to spread Hellenistic culture. Greek language and philosophy formed the foundation of Roman civilization. Our modern understanding of art, science, and philosophy owes much to this period. The Hellenistic world, born from the ashes of Alexander's empire, was a world of opportunity and exchange. It demonstrated that cultures could not only conflict, but also enrich each other, creating something new and beautiful. It was a time of great discoveries, both in geography and in human knowledge. Alexander's conquests, which began with the ambitious dream of one man, ultimately changed the course of history. They not only redrew the political map of the ancient world, but also laid the foundation for future civilizations. The spread of Greek culture, language, and ideas created a unified cultural space that stretched from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. We conclude our journey with the understanding that history is not simply a series of battles and changes of rulers. It is an ongoing process where every event, even the most dramatic, leaves its mark, influencing the future. The era of the Macedonian conquests, with its grandeur and complexities, became such a turning point that it forever changed the world, making it more connected and culturally rich. May this understanding of history, this grand tapestry of human existence, bring you peace and tranquility. The world is changing, but its changes have their own order, their own logic, their own eternal rhythm. Studying the past helps us better understand the present and look to the future with confidence. Sleep soundly, knowing that every dawn brings new opportunities and every night well-deserved rest.